Stephen, I can see you. This is great.
Right, likewise.
Yeah. So, of course, we're seeing what's going on and, watching kind of nervously at what's happening around Ukraine. All the machinations of the empire are on full display. I've even seen people that, which side are you on, sort of ambiguous during normal conditions, sort of cracking like they did when they took down Libya and had sort of staged defections, the ambassador to the UN, and, oh, I thought he was on Gaddafi's side, and this one from the Libyan parliament. And so now in the international scene, we're seeing some of these countries. I thought you were allied with Russia. I thought you were allied with the United States. And the UN vote, for example, was kind of an interesting Mouseketeer call on who's with who. So maybe you want to probe some of that with respect to particularly Latin America and Caribbean.
Yeah, and I think the vote in the UN can be somewhat misleading. And although obviously it's an important input in terms of gauging, how countries stand on a particular issue, but I think it's more important to look at longer term trends, medium term and longer term trends.
I think everyone involved, by the way, does understand it was merely symbolic, and so it's not necessarily the place to make a stand.
Yeah, and it's probably perhaps more important to look at the way countries vote in regional institutions like the Organization of American States, or as the Cubans and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans call it, the U.S. Ministry of the Colonies. And also to look at the way countries are lining up vis-a-vis the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. What's the position of CARICOM as a body of the Caribbean island nations, and so on. And it's quite interesting if you look at the region. I was quite surprised when I actually did this kind of very, very basic taxonomy of where countries stand vis-a-vis their relations with the United States and with China. Because I think, I may be wrong about this, and you certainly know more about it than I do, but I suspect that it's a reasonable argument to say that whatever Biden's war in the Ukraine is about in the short term, in the long term, it's aimed at isolating China. And I think that's, a lot of people agree about that. So, and I think that's the context in which to look at what is the position of the countries in Latin America. And so if you look at Latin America, I was quite surprised to see that really there are only 3 outright US stooges. And that is Colombia, which is basically a vast US military base of aggression against Venezuela. And shortly, I suspect, a base of maritime aggression against Nicaragua. Because ever since the 2012 judgment by the International Court of Justice in The Hague, restoring to Nicaragua something like 90,000 square kilometers of Caribbean maritime territory that Colombia had usurped since 1931. And there's been a dispute that Colombia never accepted that judgment, although it took part in the process, and it presented its arguments, and in theory it should accept the International Court of Justice judgment. In practice, what it's saying is that the judgment isn't applicable, which is essentially saying, well, we reject it. And of course they're backed up in that by the United States. And of course, one of the main reasons that they're doing that is because for the United States, drugs dealing is a very important industry.
Yeah.
And the Colombians and the United States will not be pleased if Nicaragua, which works very closely with Russia in terms of training for its anti-narcotics operations. The Russian Federation has a training unit in Nicaragua, not just for Nicaragua, but for other countries in the region as a whole. and they train the security forces of Nicaragua and its neighbors in the interdiction of drugs passing through the Caribbean and the Pacific territories of those countries. And of course, that is not to the liking of the United States, and it's certainly not to the liking of the Colombian narco-terror government. So Colombia is an outright US stooge. And also in the region, you have other countries that are also outright US stooges, like Guatemala, and in South America, Paraguay. But then if you look at across the rest of the region, then it's not so clear cut. And you have a bunch of countries that are favoring hedging their bets, but essentially favoring the United States for the moment. And those countries include Costa Rica, Chile, even under its supposedly progressive new, soon-to-be inaugurated President Gabriel Boric. Chile voted against Russia in that UN General Assembly vote, and it's not friendly to Venezuela. Boric has made the most ignorant, stupid remarks about both Venezuela and Nicaragua. So Chile is obviously, he's very much somebody in the mold of Michelle Bachelet, who's an outright US stooge.
Yeah.
But Chile has its relations with China, but for the moment, at any rate, it looks as though its foreign policy is going to lean towards supporting US positions in the region. And that's certainly true of Uruguay as well. It's probably true of Ecuador, although Ecuador has just signed a trade agreement with China. And Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso is a totally corrupt individual, typical of the kind of oligarch managerial neoliberal class favored by the United States. So for them, and in general, Ecuador's foreign policy is going to favor the United States. The same is probably true of Peru, not because President Castillo in himself favors US positions, but because he's under such incredible pressure from the Peruvian right wing, especially the right wing in the country's legislature, and that it's difficult for him to develop an independent policy. His first foreign minister was brilliant from our point of view, and is strongly anti-imperialist, pro-Venezuela, pro-Cuba, supportive of Nicaragua. And he was ejected in short order as a result of pressure from the local right-wing neoliberal oligarchy and business classes. So then in Honduras, we had this excellent result from the point of view of the domestic policies that are likely to be implemented by the new Honduran government led by Xiomara Castro, but it's far from clear what her foreign policy is going to be. And it looks as though they are under very, very heavy pressure from the United States not to stray too far from the wishes of the United States State Department in terms of foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis China, of course. And because Xiomara Castro had said, and I think she had said outright, that they would seriously consider recognizing the People's Republic of China and abandoning Taiwan, which is the country that they currently recognize. But that hasn't happened, and I suspect that it's not going to happen, but we'll see, because Honduras is also under a lot of pressure from the United States, and we all know how it's not just the political pressure, but the economic pressure and the role of foreign debt that often dictates what the foreign policy of especially vulnerable small countries like Honduras ends up being. And so then you have Panama. Now, Panama is quite interesting because they have refused to apply anti-Russian sanctions in relationship to the passage of Russian ships through the Panama Canal. Panama also recognized the People's Republic of China, but because of their deep involvement in the Western financial system, there's absolutely no way that Panama is going to seriously challenge US foreign policy overall in the region. So they made...
It's a haven, right? It's an offshore haven.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's... the Panama, do you remember the Panama paper?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
They're a tax haven. They're a crucial node for money laundering, drugs money, and other illicit funds. So they're not going to anytime soon do anything that's going to seriously challenge US foreign policy. They may take ad hoc decisions that are important for their national economy from other points of view. And obviously, and in the case of China and Taiwan, if you have a market of 20 plus million people in Taiwan, and that's competing for recognition with a market of 1.4 billion people in the People's Republic of China, you're going to recognize the People's Republic of China, obviously. But
something just fell on your camera. It looks like a piece of hair or fuzz or something.
Don't know. Oh, it was a fly. It was a fly.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
I've never seen that happen before.
A fly landed on the camera.
Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
It was probably a CIA.
Yeah, it's a bug. It's a bug.
So then the other body that is hedging their bets and generally favouring the United States in the region is CARICOM, which is the Community of Caribbean Island Nations, and they're really I'm caught in a real bind because China is currently working with Cuba in particular to develop the Cuban economic options, investing in infrastructure and so on. And also it's likely that when eventually, and I think it is a question of when and not if, the Chinese do build the Nicaraguan canal, which I'm sure they'll do in the next 5 to 10 years. When they do that, that is going to completely change the options of the Caribbean region in terms of trade and tourism and so on. So, but for the moment, if you look at CARICOM's voting in the OAS, at the Organization of American States, and they're kind of resistant to completely falling over and doing whatever the United States wants, and that's certainly not the case. I mean, they do try and maintain a principled position. For example, they used to in regard to Nicaragua. And for several years, after 2018, the United States desperately tried to get enough votes in the OAS to apply the so-called Democratic Charter of the Organization of American States, and they couldn't do it because the CARICOM nations voted against or abstained. Right. So, and in the Caribbean, you have a couple of island nations, Santa Lucia, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that are very close to the Alba bloc. Now that changes from periodically when there's a change of government in those small Caribbean island nations. But on the whole, you have that block of 4 countries that have benefited a lot from Venezuela and Cuban-driven development cooperation programs. So, but in the current context, I think all the Caribbean nations, apart from Cuba, voted in favor of the anti-Russian resolution in the UN. But and again, I think that like the other countries I've just mentioned, Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, Ecuador, Peru, Honduras, and Panama, the CARICOM island nations are kind of monitoring things, and they're going to go with the flow of what is in their best interests. And as Chinese influence grows in the region, which it will, they're steadily going to, and we'll see this, and it's just obvious that we're going to see it. Yeah. We'll see them shift the emphasis of their foreign policy in small ways over time, but the cumulative effect will be to um, uh, abandon the positions of the United States State Department in the region and favor positions that are more friendly to China. And so then going on to that block of countries that are still hedging their bets in the region, but actually favoring China. And I'd say that the three main countries, and this may surprise you, I think Brazil is among that group.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm partly because of the legacy that Lula left behind prior to the 2016 ouster of Dilma Rousseff from the so-called BRICS countries.
Right.
But the kind of legacy of, what was it, something like 10 years of Lula da Silva's advocacy for a multipolar world inside the BRICS framework before he had to cede power to his colleague Dilma Rousseff. And then there was that decisive oust in 2016. But even despite that, right, the Brazilian oligarchy, the Brazilian ruling classes, the Brazilian business classes, they can see the writing on the wall, and they can see that the United States is in decline, and their best economic options are to go with China.
These are all political, right? Okay, just interrupt for 1 second. These are all political considerations, but I think also driving it are the material considerations, which is, I mean, BRICS came into being really as an economic structure. I mean, it was kind of birthed out of the IMF in its first conceptual thing. What it became was something entirely different. But some people who play with money and other economic, items said to themselves and saw apparent in the developing economy of the world, these four originally and then five countries have many things in common, many synergistic aspects in terms of their development going forward, and there should be coordination of these things because you'll have amplifiers on it. And those things are true no matter who's sitting in a presidential palace in Brazil or India or China or Russia or whatever. And so I think that despite the fact that Lula's out and the right wing is in charge, as you said, the oligarchy there recognized that there's money to be made doing business with Russia and China and India and South Africa, and everyone else involved in those things do also. Why would you not want to do it if it's possible to do it?
Yeah, and for a huge economy like Brazil, and what's the population of Brazil? It's almost 300 million.
Yeah, 250, 300 million, somewhere in there.
Yeah,
and so, United States.
It's and for a country like Brazil, and even with somebody like Bolsonaro in the presidency, and the presidency in Brazil changes every 4 years, or it didn't in Lula's time, but it's a bit like the United States. It doesn't matter who's the president. Right. And there's sufficient inertia in the economic and political and social, economic and cultural planning processes that countries will go in the direction that they've been going in for some time without some radical revolutionary change. And Bolsonaro, despite appearances, did not undertake any serious radical revolutionary change in most of Brazil's foreign policies. And he was more reactionary in terms of domestic policy and in terms of neoliberal privatization and so on, right? And the privatization of the pre-sal resources and so on. But in terms of foreign policy, and there really hasn't been that much difference over the last 4 years. And so continuing with these countries that are hedging their bets but favoring China, and I'd put Bolivia in that category, because Bolivia, although they're a member of ALBA, under the current president, Luis Arce, and they've been much more cautious in their foreign policy. They haven't been as supportive of Nicaragua as we'd have hoped. They've been supportive of Cuba, and they've been pretty supportive of Venezuela, but nothing like to the extent that they were under the presidency of Evo Morales.
Right.
And of course, that has to do with the legacy effects of the 2019 coup.
Right.
And it would be very unfair to fault Bolivia for being cautious in terms of how they develop their foreign policy, in such especially in such a currently volatile international set of circumstances. But they continue to favour working with China and also India, and so Bolivia is a good example of a country that it's not, and how can I put it? It's not overtly kind of saying, right, we're going to completely abandon our relationships with the United States. But partly because the United States hasn't been as aggressive against Bolivia, certainly openly, and they may be being aggressive covertly, and they're certainly supporting the domestic Bolivian opposition and the separatists in Santa Cruz and so on. But for now, Bolivia seems anxious to try and maintain reasonably good relationships with the United States. Right. But even so, it's still developing its relations with China and India. So then,
I'm sorry, Nicaragua, it's only the last year, right, that because of the long history of relationship, many business relationships with Taiwan, favored Taiwan between Taiwan and China until relatively recently, despite the political aspects of it, because those other relationships were very important to Nicaragua.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why Nicaragua dumped Taiwan, and there are lots of reasons. It's not a simple equation. But one of the reasons was that Taiwan was not being as supportive as they hoped. And they, for example, prior to that decision in November, Taiwan, for the first time, as far as I can recall, voted against a loan for Nicaragua in one of the big multilateral organizations. And so, so there are a lot of factors involved. But the thing about Bolivia is that we here in Nicaragua and also in Venezuela, we could have expected much more forthright support from Bolivia, and we haven't got it. That doesn't mean that they're not generally supportive, right, but they're not as overtly supportive as they have been in the past. And that's why I think that it's fair to classify Bolivia as a country that's hedging its bets as regards the United States, but generally favouring China and its other Asian economic and trade relationships. And the other country that's hedging their bets and favouring China, obviously, is Argentina. And also Argentina, I'm sure you remember this very well, Don, and just a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago maybe, President Alberto Fernandez was visiting Vladimir Putin in Moscow prior to going on to Beijing for the opening of the Winter Olympics. And he actually openly said on television that it was very important for Argentina to develop its relationships with Russia. But obviously, look at what's happened subsequently in terms of its relationship with the IMF. And it's negotiated this deal with the IMF that many people in Argentina think is ridiculously favourable to the IMF, that the country is making concessions to the IMF that it shouldn't have to make. And essentially what they've done is they're taking another huge loan of, I think the figure is up around $40 billion, in order to be able to finance their existing debt commitments.
Right.
And in theory, they'll end up paying off the IMF in 2034, and the loan repayments will start coming into effect. The schedule of loan repayments will start coming into effect sometime 2026 or so. But that just shows you the extent to which US control of international financial institutions can hobble the development of sovereign countries' foreign relations. because you just have to look at it. A couple of months ago, Alberto Fernandez was saying we need to develop better relationships and more favourable relationships with Russia, and then he ends up tying Argentina into this essentially crippling IMF loan that is going to enable the IMF to dictate, in large part, domestic Argentine economic policy. So then that's how I see the countries hedging their bets favouring China. I think there are three: Argentina, Bolivia, and Brazil. And then you have a group of countries, a very small group of countries, who are outright US antagonists, and those are Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And if you look at those countries, and they've all successfully, to one degree or another, defeated US sanctions. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing in the current international climate, because if the US can't get its way economically, there's an increasing risk that it will seek to do so militarily. Yeah. And we don't know how that's going to play out in the current global context, but it's something to bear in mind.
Let me ask you something about what's going on right now. I saw this morning in the news, and maybe you haven't seen it yet, but within the large context of that vote at the UN and just the international configuration around what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine right now, there was an announcement that I think it was Blinken, some high-level delegation from the United States, is going down to meet with President Maduro.
I saw that.
What? You want to spitball what the hell that means?
Well, do you want my take on that?
4 minutes. You can have 4 minutes, and we got to wrap.
My take on that is not good. My take on that is, and they know that they're not going to get any concessions from Venezuela on the basis of that. And there are two possible reasons for their visit. And one is they're going to say to Venezuela, look, we'll make nicey nice with you if you do what we want vis-a-vis Ukraine. If you adopt a foreign policy position that is more favorable to ours on Ukraine, and if you kind of reduce your relationship with the Russian military advisors and the Russian military equipment and so on. They might be saying that, or they might be looking at in the longer term and saying to Venezuela, look, we're very concerned about the developing relationship of you with China, and we'd like, we're prepared to be more reasonable with you. We'll drop our recognition of Guaido, for example, and we'll roll back some of the nastier sanctions that we've imposed on you. We might influence the British to give you back the $4 billion of gold reserves that they stole from you, and there's all those kinds of things. But and they're on a loser there, and they're so stupid in the State Department that anything is possible. They might even think they have a chance of getting away with some kind of deal like that and extracting some kind of concessions by being nicer.
We're going to bribe you with your own money.
Yeah, we're going to bribe you with your own money. We might give you Citgo back, and so that is not the US style. And what has US diplomacy been for as long as you and I have been alive? Do what we want, or else.
That's right.
So I think, and if that's the case, and unless there's some unforeseen, completely radical change in US diplomacy, what they're going to say to Venezuela is, do what we want, or we're going to ramp up our military aggression against you. Not necessarily directly, but via Brazil, for example, while Bolsonaro's still in power. He won't be by November, because Lula's almost certain to win those elections unless he has a heart attack. Yeah. And so they're going to put pressure on Brazil and Colombia to ramp up military aggression against Venezuela. And I'm sure that that's what they're going to say. I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
Hope you're
But
wrong.
I look at the last decades. What is there in recent U.S. diplomatic history to suggest that they're going to make nicey nice? They're not.
No,
They're just going to go and threaten people.
it's not their
So
ever.
that's what that's about.
I've been speculating in different venues that maybe we're going to see Juan Guaido and Vladimir Zelensky sharing an apartment in Miami or something.
Right.
It's possible.
Well, and I think that's. I look at those three countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Why have they stood up to the United States? Because they insist on the concept of national sovereignty
Right.
and self-determination, and they insist on people-focused national policy. Yeah. And that all of that is anathema to the United States. I mean, so
that's what you're invoking in Ukraine. Like, so it's so hypocritical. It's absurd. It's so hypocritical.
Yeah, and Ukraine is an occupied country, and Brian Berletic and others are absolutely right when they say that, and it's ridiculous to claim that Russia has invaded a sovereign country. It was a country under a neo-colonial occupation by the United States.
All right, Stephen, thank you so much. I enjoyed doing this. Maybe we'll do it again next week.
Yeah, sure, right. And you let me know.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.